I'll start with uh, my LDD screen. I'm not one of the newer generation that is into StatIO yet.
Okay.
I'm still quite old school.
Yeah.
But I'll first just give you a bit of a breakdown on what I'm going to be presenting and
Great.
a bit of an intro.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, great. So yeah, despite what everybody seems to think, I'm definitely not an expert at this stuff. What follows is just my observations after building a few mocks and viewing many others.
You lie, you are an expert.
Thanks, Joe. Most people won't build a landscape as I just depicted this afternoon, but I did it this way just to point out a few concepts, the thinking, the planning, and the processes involved. According to the New Oxford American Dictionary and Wikipedia, a landscape is the visible features of an area of land, its landforms, and how they interact with natural or man-made features. So yeah, so it's mostly natural. A landscape is natural. So pretty much when you're doing a mock with a landscape, you're going to start with the natural elements. In any situation, the natural came first. It's the right place to start. You're not going to take a building and just build around it. Plan your layout. As Wayne said in his wonderful masterclass, he really knows where you stand, lets you know where you stand in the building hierarchy. I obviously know very little, but he said use reference material. In the case of a landscape, you wouldn't use so much concept art. You would use most probably more photos of real landscape areas, references of cliffs or mountains or hills or rivers that you would like to make your mock look like. So you're going to take this reference material and use the parts you have and see how you can recreate it. I wouldn't say, I wouldn't deter you from looking at other people's mocks and what they did, but I would say try and do it your own way. It often makes for much more interesting builds than trying to copy other people's techniques. I will obviously be showing you the most common techniques today, but it doesn't necessarily mean you have to use them. Yeah, as Wayne said in his masterclass, unified design language. It kind of applies here as well. In a landscape, be consistent. Build the things the same way. Build your rocks the same way. Build so that people can understand what you're trying to show. And it seems sci-fi and landscape building go hand in hand. As Wayne said, detail. Detail is always what keeps your viewer interested. And it is honestly normally the most fun part of a build. Another thing that applies from Wayne's build is in the natural world, there are no 90 degrees. Everything is curved. There are no real straight lines. So with that, let's get started. Let me see if I can kill my video so you don't have to see my big scary face on your giant TV screens. And there we have my LDD. Hopefully everybody can see that.
100%. That looks great. Thanks.
Okay, great. So my starting point is I have a little mock that I made of a wagon. Now this wagon, if you just dump it on a table as a display, it's not going to look very interesting. It's going to attract one or two looks and people are going to move on. So it really won't do justice just to drop it down. So I thought, let's put it in a diorama and make it a bit more interesting, give it maybe a campsite around it. Villy always says, put it in the world it belongs in. So let's make a diorama. So basically, I'm going to use 4 32 by 32 base plates. I'm using mills. Mills is a modular integrated landscaping standard. There's quite a bit on the internet about it. Zaulag has its own standard, which is not the same as the international standard, slightly modified. Okay, it's not necessary for you to put it on mills. You can use normal base plates. I just find mills does have some advantages that will hopefully become more apparent down the line. So with nature, you're always following the rules of nature, and with water always runs in the lowest area of a landscape. So we're going to start with our river. Obviously, a straight river is not very natural. So we're going to have to design it and make it look a bit more natural. Let's do that. So yeah, I've added a bit of a waterfall, a pond. I've given a few level changes, which help the waterfall, and the level changes help it make it look like the water is flowing in a direction. So that's our waterfall and our river. When designing a river, just bear in mind that a river will always run basically the laws of nature. So your river is going to run until something makes it change direction. So when you're actually building your landscape, you'll have to remember to put rocks where the water actually changes its direction, because obviously rocks will be a bit harder for the river to flow through, so it will change the direction of the river. We're going to add our campsite just so that we can plan our layout a bit better. So our campsite will then be next to the river with a little path down to the river so that the people can actually access the water. I might just point out that the planning is normally quite critical in these builds. Previously, I had my waterfall and my pond, and I had my camping site right in front of it. I had the river running a nice, beautiful diagonal. But I realized once I actually placed the wagon on the campsite, I'm not going to see any of that detail behind the wagon. So I actually redesigned the layout so that the water is not as interesting as it would have been running diagonally, but at least it allows you to see it. So as I mentioned previously, your river runs on the lowest part of your landscape, so it's not the best having it on top of the ground. So let's drop it down slightly. So here we've dropped the river. So now it's running basically on your water table, which is our base plate. And we obviously still have the waterfall that goes higher than the ground. We've also dropped the camping site because as people have moved around the camping site, they've worn it down, they've walked on the grass, they've killed the grass, so it's slightly lower than the rest of the ground level. Next, we're going to look at, obviously, because our waterfall is higher than our main level, we've got to decide what is our highest level that we need to build up to. So we build our high ground. So I've made the high ground slightly higher than the top level of the river. And so that's the highest point we're going to have to build our mock up to. Obviously, your high ground is at the back of your mock, because if you put it in the front of your mock, nobody's going to see anything. Also, according to the laws of nature, the river would have run for many years down this little path, and it's cut away into your high ground. So it's been eroding your cliff face or your high ground to give you that little indentation in your cliff face. What's the next one? So on our previous slide, the minifigs didn't have any access to the river, so we've added a little gradient, a little slope for our minifigs to actually get to the water. So that is a good place for me to point out or to discuss gradients. So the color schemes for building a landscape. Most of the time, it's obviously going to be your greens. As you noticed in the previous mock, I use mostly plates. It gives a very interesting texture to the ground. It looks a bit more like grass than actual tiles would, because they're quite smooth. You would use them more for watery scenes and so on and so forth. Any greens, whatever, well, any colors you can use, you basically use the complementary colors as we saw in Wayne's talk on his color wheel. Obviously, the browns you would use more for a deserty scene where there's sand, sandstone. Whites you would use snowy scenes. Blues we mainly reserve for water. The grays, they're also kind of reserved. They're reserved more for your rock formations. And these last four colors, generally not often used in a landscape, but they are used when, for example, building fantasy. You can actually make some interesting scenes if you use these alternate colors. So those are your basic plates, nice texture. Tiles a bit too smooth for landscapes. You can use them. There are examples when you can use them, like at the bottom of a little mud pit, or filling enough steps when someone's actually left footprints in the mud. So back to the gradients. Normal gradient is just stepping up. This is actually quite a steep gradient because we're only skipping one stud at a time. You can make a less steep gradient by skipping a few studs at a time. Obviously, you don't have to skip the same amount. You can vary it, make a different gradient, make a more interesting gradient. 90% of the time, most people don't have the amount of plates I'm showing you. Nice thing about these plates at the moment, they're on the pick a brick wall at the LCS. So it is nice and convenient to get. These bricks, as far as I know, are still on the pick a brick wall. So you could quite easily just make a gradient using bricks and plates. You don't constantly just have to use plates. Another alternative is to actually make your gradient out of any color you have and then just cover it in the color you want it to be. When building a gradient, big steps are not always the best. It gives that flat tile-like surface which doesn't look quite textured. So when you're building, if you do happen to get some of those appearing, so like here I've got two steps, you can hide it with one small item, or maybe a small rock, or maybe a plant, and that will hide those steps, giving you that uniform look of one step up at a time. Obviously, you don't just have to use plates. You can use wedge plates as well. It also gives a very nice look to your gradients. I generally find that most people don't have a large stock of gradient plates. So if you pop them all down in one spot of your build, of your mock, you might find that you lose that unified design language that Wayne was talking about. It loses its conformity. So one side will have all the wedge plates, which doesn't quite look like the other side of your mock. So that's gradients. Hopefully a few hints that will help you build up your landscape. Next up is rocks. So generally rocks, like I said, the reserved colors are your light grays and your dark grays. So most people use slopes. You don't necessarily have to use slopes, but it is, as I said, the current or the most used item. You don't necessarily only have to use the grays. In deserts, you would use all the tans and the nougats to show your sandstones. The grays are wonderful for granites, that type of rock that you want to depict, where the browns are wonderful for sandstone. Obviously, if you're doing a snowy landscape, the whites and the aqua gives a bit of depth to the white, which looks quite nice. The greens, wonderful for depicting moss and lichens on your rock in damp areas. Very nice to use. Lego quite often depict rock work as a burp, so a big ugly rock piece. Most people have a few of these, and if you have to use them to build your cliff face, not a problem. Just try and break them up a little, disguise them with a few slopes, a few plants, and it kind of breaks up that shape, so it doesn't necessarily look as square and blocky anymore. And one block doesn't look like the next 10 blocks. Current convention, building a cliff face, is just using a lot of slopes, generally keeping the angles changing. You can put in bricks as well, just if you're running out of slopes or you don't have plenty of them. It gives a nice look. It's not very straight lines or blockish. Alternative method is to use snot, like Wayne is so often fond of using on his builds. So with the snot layout, you get a nice layer format. So as I mentioned earlier, the tans would be nice for sandstone. So would the snot method, because you would get that layered effect you have on sedimentary rocks or limestone. So this is a very nice technique for those kind of rocks, depending on what you're building, depending on your reference material. Another technique which is becoming very popular these days, and I can understand it because you don't always just have straight slopes to use. A lot of us have the curved pieces in different colors. So I must admit, this is not one of my fortes. I'm not very good at building rock pieces or rock shapes with these pieces. But it is becoming a very popular technique amongst builders. So it gives a nice rounded look to your cliffs and your rocks. It might even make it look more natural, as erosion would round them slightly more than give them sharp angles. Okay, so on to water. So water, the main colors in water are obviously blue, as mentioned earlier. Most people would think that plates aren't usable, but the plates give you that feeling of the rougher water, the more faster moving, rapid areas in your river. The lighter blues would give you the impression that the water is slightly shallower, where the darker blues would give you the impression that the water is slightly deeper. The tiles are used for slow moving water, obviously a lot calmer. You can use the white as well for rapid areas or where there's slightly more motion and bubbly water. A popular way of doing water these days is to use the trans bricks. So we have the trans light blue and the trans white, or the clear. And these are used to make the water. It gives a very nice look on an actual mock. Unfortunately, in LDD, as you can see, the bricks don't show up as clearly as would be nice. Same concept. You have the plates for the slightly rougher water and the tiles for the slightly slow moving water. And once again, the Transclear for the slightly more frothy water. The greens are often used in like stagnant water, so where your water is not moving at all. The dark greens are often quite nice, and a lot of people use the cream tile, which actually also gives quite a nice look. Unfortunately, as far as I know, they're only available in 1x1, so you actually need quite a few of them. So the most basic technique for building water is obviously just using your tiles. So you have your lighter tile depicting the slightly shallower water, darker tile, the deeper water, your white bricks showing a bit of froth when it hits the stone in the riverway. And that's your most basic form of river. You can do the same thing in your trance bricks. So you could use darker trance blue and lighter trance blue, and once again your clear trance plates and tiles for the frothy water. Unfortunately, they don't show up that well. They show up slightly better in a real build, but I often prefer using still the opaque bricks to depict the slightly more frothy waters. An alternative method for using the trance bricks is actually to change the color of the bricks under the trance bricks. So that changes the color that you see from above. So if you put white under the trance clear plates and tiles, it actually shows up a bit better. Also, as mentioned earlier, the greens are often used for nice stagnant swampy water, which is normally not too rough, but just in pools and swamps. Once again, snot is another alternative we can use for water and river. So yeah, we have a few snot plates. Once again, lighter colors for shallower areas and darker colors for deeper areas. Whites for the frothier water. Bricks can also be used. These bricks, this look gives a nice, it gives a nice look for the swamps and your stagnant water. I've seen a couple of mocks that really look nice. In real life, they actually are quite reflective. So you can often get the reflection of a building standing next to the water showing up in your swamp or your pond. I previously used the lime for swamp water because I didn't have enough dark green. And in America, they have this little weed that often grows in swamps and stagnant water called the duckweed. So I made my swamp lime green. So I implied it was covered with this duckweed. I added a few trance bricks wherever the duckweed was moved out of the way. So like when this duck is swimming through the duckweed, you can actually see the trance screen of the stagnant water below. When doing the snot technique, you might think it's quite unstable, but if you use a 1x1 brick with stud on side, or even the 1x4s, you find that your snot brick is actually lying on the studs, so it makes it quite stable. They don't dent in too easily, and it allows you to give your water a nice edge if necessary. My last bit of water pieces is obviously you don't have to make water always make it flat. This is a technique I used for waves. So it actually, this one has, I've taken the trance bricks away so that you can get a clearer picture of what I did. I just gave it a nice gradient on the one side as the wave is going up to break. There is a half a stud indentation done with jumpers so that you can give the wave a bit of a curve around the back. And in the front, as it's breaking, there's a bit of a drop in water level. And yeah, where it has started breaking, once again, just a gradient with frothy water. So back to our build. Okay, so now it actually gets a bit boring again. We've started adding our gradients and our rock around our river. So as I mentioned, the water will change direction where it hits rocks. So we've added rocks in everywhere around the riverbed, keeping it where it's going. We've added some nice gradients to get from water level up to our campsite level. And we've started our gradients going up to meet our high ground. Next one, we're continuing with our up to our high ground. So I didn't want a very big cliff face here, so I've added a slight stopover, and I've started the rock work around the pool. So here we have that one side complete. We've added our rock work, just a bunch of slopes, inverted and normal slopes. This is for a little bit of vegetation coming later. And then we've completed the top of our level. You can see it's slightly higher than the other side, just to give it a better rounded look. As obviously landscape's not always totally flat, erosion will cause a more rounded look. And we will continue with the next phase. So yeah, we've completed the pond, added the rock work to the other side. Once again, just a few slopes and cheese wedges. And our level is coming down back to our camp level. Thanks, Philly. A bit of reverb. Let's complete our cliff face going past the back of our campsite. I decided to put a cliff face here because, as I mentioned earlier, our wagon is quite high, so it would most probably block out most of that cliff face. When building your cliff face, try add as much detail as you can. Yeah, I've got a little bit of a cave. You can add fissures and cracks and quite a few items you can add to a cliff face. Let's complete our landscape by building the rest of the high ground. And so there, we brought the high ground down to the top of our little cliff. And we have a layout. So this technique is actually quite versatile. As you can see in the next slide, I've just changed the colors. Instead of green, I've used tan. And I've made the riverbed dark tan. So you've got a dry riverbed in a desert. Same build, just different colors. If we do that again and we replace it with whites, you have a snow build. So you have a rather cold landscape, replace the watercolor with trans blue to imitate ice, obviously. And we have a winter landscape, same build, just different colors. You notice why I don't use trans blue too much, because it doesn't show up really well in LDD. Moving on. So now that we have our landscape finished, we can start adding the details to the waters. I'm using just the normal opaque tiles. The tiles for the slower flowing areas of the river. Plates for the areas where there's a bit of rapids and faster moving water. All the way up to the pond, the waterfall, obviously quite boisterous and making a lot of splashes and causing a lot of foam, which we will add in the next image. So yeah, we've given our water some color, added a few light spots, foamy areas for the rapids, and the waterfall where it comes over the edge and crashes down below it. Next, we'll start adding some vegetation, I think. So where a waterfall crashes and falls down, it's going to make a lot of splash. It's going to put a lot of moisture into the air. You're going to find that the area is quite damp. So you'll often find mosses growing on your rocks. So these are actually now dark green just to depict some moss. And we have vegetation that is enjoying all that moisture in the air. And typically I would only put that type of vegetation there because it's suited to that area because it's quite damp. Let's add vegetation around the river. So yeah, we have our plants that like lots of water. So they're obviously growing on the water edge. And generally in the mock, this is the only place I would put these plants because you're trying to depict, as Wayne said, a unified design language. You're trying to depict consistency. So these plants grow close to water. They enjoy damp soil, a lot of water. So I won't put them anywhere else in my display. Next, we're adding trees. I'm not going to go into great detail on building vegetation. There are a lot of tutorials on vegetation on the internet. For this mock, I just did some basic trees using a few bars and clips. So using the same combination, you can actually angle your plants to go in different directions, and not all your branches are pointing in the same direction. And we've given a few trees that hopefully look like pine trees. It's always nice to try and think of a type of tree or vegetation you're trying to recreate and build it as close to that vegetation as possible. You'll notice I've added some roots, just a little bit of detail for your trees, and it is often quite useful to help you remember where you placed your trees when they fall off in transit. So. Next, I've just added a bit of detail in our trees, once again following basically the laws of nature. I know lots of people like to put mushrooms everywhere. I tend to put them where they would occur naturally, under shady trees where it's a bit damper and not direct sunlight. I've added a fallen tree. The fallen tree is still slightly alive, still growing its branches out, trying to get a bit of sunlight. And next up is just a bit more vegetation. So we've added longer grasses. These are not as water hungry as those growing next to the river, and they tend to grow in the direct sunlight, so they're not upstairs here by the trees. And also I've added a few, considering those are pine trees, they won't be leaves on the ground, they'll be needles. And that would complete our landscape. So that is my basic landscape and how I would go through the steps. Now, we did want to put our wagon on, so we will add our wagon and all our man-made features because they come last, nature comes first. So yeah, we've added our wagon, added our minifigs, given them a bit of firewood, a nice fireplace, a few logs to sit on. Their horses tethered in the field, and obviously he's gone and eaten all the long grass he can reach around him. And that is the finished mock. One more thing, just going back to the moles. Because these are each designed on a moles plate, you can actually take that same mock and rearrange it. And get a totally different look. So with a bit of planning, I made sure the edges match up. And all I've done here is covered the little piece of the camping site with a few green plates to get rid of the worn down area. And we have a slightly different mock without actually building anything different. And that is it.
Oh, wow. Paul, that was absolutely brilliant.
Thank you. I most probably left out half I wanted to say, but...
Yeah, it always works like that. I used to be a big or listener to 702, and especially to John Robbie. And John Robbie, when he used to introduce people, it was very, very few and far between that he would introduce somebody as a rock of common sense. And I think from that presentation, you can all see that Paul Doran, and I've mentioned it to him a lot of times, he's a rock of common sense. And he's bloody annoying when it comes to that. So just like over time, the water has eroded the cliff face so that the waterfall is a little bit inwards. And there's just all these, like I now have to go back home and change all my rivers because there's no rocks where the rivers change direction. And it just makes sense. And from a personal example, I was building an old dilapidated house and I was struggling with the roof, and I put some leaves on the roof and it looked really pretty. And I was so proud of it. And I took a photo and I sent it to Paul, and I was hoping he would come back and say, sure, that looks nice. What does Paul come back with? Where's the tree that dropped the flowers on the house? So he's always that one step ahead. And I think, that's also what Wayne alluded to this morning is, does it make sense what you're building? Think a little bit further than what you're doing. And I think I enjoyed the presentation a lot. And I'd love to see if there's any questions in the room, if anybody wants to ask any questions, or Ferdi, if you want to take it on while we look for questions.
All good. I mean, so Paul, just while you and I are going through it, I decided to just go and take some of those ugly blurps and just go and put in a few extra angles and some greenery and trying to apply some of the thinking that you have there. And it's amazing how that's just changed my view on using these angles. And if I think the same as what Wayne said, that piece is gonna come off very easily. But I mean, you master guys, you make it look so easy, right? And it's years of experience and using your LDD. Maybe just tell some of the guys who don't know and girls on the show who don't know what LDD is. Just give them a quick 5-second view of LDD.
Okay. Let me just share that screen again. Switch off my video. Oh, too late. So LDD is Lego's original tool to build Lego digitally. It is a bit outdated. I know they don't support it much anymore. The new version from Bricklink, which is now owned by Lego, is most probably going to be the most supported item. That is Stat.io. I just I find it a little bit complex for my old brain. But LDD, it has all your parts in it. You can pick which color you want to use. It's actually got quite a bit of functionality. You can build templates, which you can then bring in. So let's say I bring in that template also on moles. So you can then quickly build up your mock. So now suddenly my mock has a brick wall in it.
Are you doing this all live, right? This is on the fly. This is not like a pre-recording now.
No, this is on the fly. Just the tree's angles make it very hard to get in there. So you can just... add your sections. So I have quite a few mills pieces designed. There's a bit of a road with a mud pool in it, another section of road. So for me to actually design a mock, just the basic concept is actually quite easy.
Very nice. Well, we'd like to give away another set of Lego. Do you want to maybe think of a question and we can ask the guys, or that you can ask them, and then we can judge some of the respondents. Some of the questions we are getting while you're thinking about your question is obviously around LDD. Yes, guys, go and Google it. You can download it. It's for free. The Cape Peninsula mock, that was also done on LDD, so good information there. The 32 by 32 base plates, you mentioned a mill standard. I posted a link from Zal Lug. And I think you're right, people can go and just look that up, right? And when they collaborate, then just agree on what version or what kind of
it's basically, it's just an idea. Whenever you want to build something based on mills, you would collaborate with whoever you're building with and decide on the rules of your builds, where your rivers would meet, where your roads would meet, what your base height is. The Zarlag one is slightly higher than the international one, but as you saw, it makes it nice and easy to drop your rivers into it, gives you that extra bit of height to work with. If you wanted to make low areas inside the mills, it also works quite well.
And that then drives your collaboration. So this is not just about building structures, but if you're following a standard, more people can build them on their own and then come together and then add them together, right?
Correct. So if your edges are according to the mill standard, anybody can add their mills to your mills.
Lovely.